book of Ephesians. Paul is writing to the saints. He is writing about how the saints ought to treat one another in light of how God has treated us. He begins in chapter 1 by telling the saints that God has chosen you. Man, if that were all he wrote, that would be such an amazing truth. Like, God choosing anyone, that's stinking cool. So God has saved us by grace and through faith. He has chosen us. He has adopted us. And Paul wants us to know that nothing we did earned that. In fact, all people are sinful, right? Like, we have messed up. We have denied God. We have rebelled against him. We have lived entitled lives, selfish lives. But God has chosen you. If you are in Christ, God has chosen you despite you, despite all the sin in your life. Like, this is cool. This is good news. Like, this is great news right here. And then Paul goes on in chapter 1 to say, because of this, for this reason, because God has chosen you, is by grace alone. You did nothing. This is the unconditional love of God. Because of this, I give thanks for you all the time. It's like this truth about God and what God has done and how God has treated us, how God has chosen us and adopted us despite anything of us, not by works, but by grace. Because of that, now Paul, like God has done with him, now Paul gives thanks for the saints in a way that is unconditional, that is not based on anything the saints do or don't do. He doesn't accept people based on their theology. He doesn't thank God for people. He doesn't have gratitude for people because they're part of one generation or another. He doesn't do it because they're of one ethnicity or another. No, he gives thanks for people simply because God has chosen them unconditionally and adopted them unconditionally. They are children of God. See, in Christ, before God the Father, there is no there's no choosing, or there's no separation based on ethnicity. There's no bringing together. There's no separation based on a generational identity. There's no separation. There's no bringing together of people based on theological convictions, denominations. There's no separating or bringing people together based on anything that is of us. And there's not even separating based on people's sins. God chooses unconditionally. Therefore, we choose one another unconditionally. This is what the whole book of Ephesians is about. The unconditional love of God, the unconditional adoption of God, and therefore our unconditional love and acceptance of one another. Now, acceptance is not the same as support, right? God doesn't support sin, but he accepts those who sin on the basis of his choosing, of his adopting. And therefore, if we are in Christ, there are no divisions among us. Christian culture is a culture of unity, not disunity. I'm talking about true Christian culture here. It's a culture of unity, not disunity. It's not a culture of dividing lines. It's not a culture of heavy criticism, though some have made it that, right? That's not biblical Christianity. Instead, this is a culture where we pursue truth together, love, justice together, peace together, edifying one another rather than tearing one another down, giving thanks always for one another. Why? Because God chooses us unconditionally. Therefore, we choose one another unconditionally too. And if we want to see peace in the church, if we want to see peace in our world, if we want to see true justice, if we want to see mercy, if we want to see loving kindness as a matter of what it means to be human living upon God's earth, It begins with this: instead of being hypercritical, which Paul could have done, instead of thinking lowly of other people and highly of ourselves for whatever reason, instead, take a step back, give thanks for those who are in Christ. Why? Because God has chosen us. Because God has adopted us. There's no other reason. We live according to who God is and what God is doing, not according to what we see other people doing that we disagree with.